So, Josh, thank you for sticking with me and having a bonus discussion. You kind of teased this in our official talk about your time living in China. Before we kind of get into the futuristic stuff that was happening there, what was it like living in China? I've never lived there.
You know, granted, I lived most of my time in China before COVID, right? So
Mhm.
this is really a pre-COVID conversation here for me, but it was very unique, and in a good way. I enjoyed it. Now, granted, I was in the very, very far west. So if you can think, like, I was a stone's throw from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan,
All
Tajikistan.
right.
So it
Yep.
was really more Central Asia. But I loved that blend of both that Central Asian culture and the Chinese culture. It is so rich, like the culture is. And as much as I actually, believe it or not, hated the language before arriving in China, I began, as I lived in the country, to really see the beauty of the calligraphy and the beauty
Mhm.
of the way that they speak. It was one of the best times of my life, and my wife and I have now still spent more of our married life in China than we have anywhere else in the world.
That's that's very cool. That's cool that you were able to
Yeah,
see that and see that beauty that is everywhere. That's really everywhere in the world.
yeah.
So, I think you caught a lot of people's attention in our first show where you were talking about government surveillance. So, kind of tell us about what the Chinese government was doing while you were there.
Yeah, I think most people are aware of Tibet, right? There's been
Mhm.
a lot of activism having to do with Tibet. And really, frankly, nowadays, most people have at least heard of what's happening with the Uyghur people in Northwest China. It's a region called Xinjiang, and that's the region where my wife and I lived for about 10 years. It's a I mean, I liken it to like Alaska. It is,
Mm.
as far as geography, it is gorgeous. In terms of culture, it really is. It was a wonderful place to live, but in part because of that Muslim part of the Central Asian people, the Uyghur people, China was just extremely sensitive about that region. And so what that resulted in was just an insane amount of surveillance. So the guy who was the governor of Tibet, that turned Tibet into what it is,
Mhm.
was moved up to Xinjiang, and he became the governor of Xinjiang, and he implemented pretty much those same things. So I remember, when I first got there, I could enter and exit my what would you call it? Just my neighborhood in many different places. And then by the time that let's say 3 or 4 years later in that particular city, there was one entry and exit point. Everything else was locked
Ooh.
off. And then there were cameras everywhere. And if you had an ID card, you had to swipe the ID card to get in. And it was just that level of
Wow.
scrutiny and that level of surveillance that it, it was uncomfortable. And yet I
Mhm.
say that I think it's very much like the whole frog in a boiling pot analogy,
Right.
where
Yeah.
when you live through it, you don't really realize until you have friends come visit and they're like, how the heck do you live in this kind of
Yeah.
like oppressive surveillance? And you look around and go, yeah, I guess that is kind of bad. I didn't realize, you know?
Right. Right. And it's those small incremental changes that we don't notice
Yeah.
as humans. And I've learned a lot about that. I mean, cognitively speaking, we don't notice those things. And the whole frog in
Yeah.
the pot of and for those of you who may not be familiar with it, if you put a frog in boiling water, chances are he will jump out because he knows that it's hot. If you put it in the water, put him in the water when it's cool, and you turn up the temperature slowly, he'll boil because he doesn't notice the change. I don't know if that's scientific or not, or
I don't know either.
but it makes sense, and that is true, that
Yeah.
it's just these small changes over time. I have heard, you said this on a video, I went and looked it up, that surveillance went as far as they were putting QR codes on knives. Is that correct?
They were. That was a specific region of Xinjiang where they were doing that. And basically what it was is registering that knife. So that QR
Mm-hmm.
code was registered to the ID of the person who purchased that. Let's say it was just a meat cleaver,
Mm-hmm.
or some kitchen knife or something like that that was super sharp. Just this over the top worry that these knives were going to be used in a malicious way, and they wanted to be able to track whoever owned those knives. But even beyond that, so that I feel like was just kind of a meh, like it sounds sensational, but to me it's like, it's your kitchen knife, who the hell cares?
Hmm.
But what was really interesting to me is that in order to track people, right, there's a lot that you can do with obviously people's cell phones,
Right.
those GPS trackers that we love just keeping in our pockets all the time. And there's a lot that you can do with, cameras that are all around. But there is a small bit of privacy that happens within your apartment. And so the way that they would get around that is they actually put a QR code inside our door, right? So
Hmm.
like you couldn't see it from outside. And randomly, the local police from our district would stop by, and they would do this. It wasn't just for the foreigners; it was actually for any of the people that went in our district. There was three of them, and they had their rounds. And they would come in, and the way that they would prove that they had looked around our apartment and that they had seen that everything looked okay, there wasn't anything suspicious going on, we weren't meeting with people we should, I don't know what they were looking for necessarily, is
Hmm.
they would have to scan that QR code. And that QR code would say, basically, we have come into this house and we have checked it at this time of day. And that was, I mean, again, it's one of those things where it's like, fine, look at my house. I've got nothing I'm trying to hide here.
Hmm.
But at the same time, that's my privacy. That's my
Right.
home. And
Hmm.
and I didn't really enjoy that aspect of it.
Yeah, I would not enjoy that either. Um, like as an American sitting here, hearing all of this, it's really hard for me to like fathom that this is a thing. Um, what was what was the reasoning that you were given from the government that all of this had to happen, or was there even any?
Oh, I mean, I think it's the same reason that we've got this whole charade of TSA at the airport. It's for your safety. This is for
Mm,
your safety,
mm,
okay? And it was the same thing where it's like, hey, this is for your safety. So now that you know that everybody's getting the same treatment, we're looking in everybody's house, so you should be relatively unconcerned about all your neighbors because we've checked in on them. And I think that's the excuse that's so often used for anything that is invading or encroaching on our privacy is, well, hey, we're just trying to keep you safe here.
mm.
And I'm sure there's well-meaning people that believe that.
Sure.
And yet it's like I said in our earlier episode, privacy is just one of those things that once you give it up, once we gave up and started using this TSA model, you, you just can't go back. And so now we've adopted this model where you can just buy your way through, right? I've bought whatever, what do you call those? Like
Yeah.
you clear or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. I know what you're
It
talking about.
doesn't do anything. Yeah, it doesn't do
Yeah.
anything except just, say that, oh, well, apparently I cared enough to buy it. And so now I can get through TSA a lot quicker.
Right. Yeah. Because a terrorist would never buy that ever. Yeah. And that's,
Exactly.
and we call that kind of security theater. But and
Yep.
occasionally it'll catch somebody doing something. But mentally and emotionally for you, living in a place that was so heavily surveilled, did you ever feel that burden?
I did. Most of the time, I didn't feel it until I actually left. I
Hmm.
think that's common for any stressful situation or any oppressive situation is God's kind of designed our bodies to be able to just cope in whatever
Hmm.
way that we can
Yeah.
cope. And because of that, we don't really realize how we're coping until we're taken out of that situation, whether it's an abusive, relationship or
Hmm.
name that
Hmm.
that situation. And it was the same thing for us, where let's say we'd vacation down in Thailand or Philippines or something like that because it was close and it was nice. And then you get there and you sit down and you go, oh, wow, like
Mm.
I don't see cameras everywhere.
Right.
Literally where we were, we would have, before we could walk into our grocery store, there was an armored vehicle with a patrol person, just sitting in front. And that was a normal thing for my son, who was 3 years old at the time, to go through, or to get into his kindergarten. He had to go through armed patrol and barbed wire fences and all that stuff just to get into his kindergarten. And, you just accept that until you don't have to anymore. And then you realize, oh my gosh, that was just a heavy burden to carry.
Right. So you talk about the armed guards and the barbed wire and the fencing. what was the actual threat there? Was it an uprising of the people? Is that what they were concerned about? What was their, what was the enemy, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to have to go too far into the history of it all. Like there's
Hmm.
just culturally the Muslim groups there and the Chinese groups just haven't
Okay.
gotten along.
Okay.
And back in 2009, there were riots in the street that killed hundreds of people.
Okay.
And then China just has had these instances of, specifically with schools where some person, deranged person, I don't even
Hmm.
know if it's Chinese or Uyghur or what, but they go in and just kind of like what we have, you've talked about before with school shootings, except
Hmm.
because they don't have legal guns that they can carry, they use much more personal weapons that just feel,
Mm.
it
Yeah.
just feels worse for some reason when it's a knife.
Oh yeah.
And so, in a culture that's been raised over the past few decades to have only one child, even though that's
Mm.
changed now, but it's still kind of part of the mindset.
Right.
Protecting that one child at all costs is a huge thing. And so, yeah, anything
Yeah.
having to do with schools is just heavy, heavy, heavy surveillance.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, do you feel, I mean, you said earlier that this, I think you were kind of living in the future a little bit when you were there.
Yeah.
Do you think this sort of stuff is going to spread around the world, or is this just going to be one location that was just unusual, an outlier?
Unfortunately, I don't think it's an outlier. One thing I will say to China's credit, if you want to say it this way, is that at least they're not trying to hide the fact that they're doing this. Like
True.
it's out in
Okay.
the open. It's like,
Yeah.
listen, we're doing this, like it or not, we're collecting all this information. And I was actually brought in and questioned a couple times, and I saw at least, the printout of my file, whatever it was
Hmm.
that they had on me. I didn't get to see the file itself, but it was a thick file. And just knowing, it's kind of that recognition that, oh, okay, I know they're watching me. I know that they're keeping tabs on me just because they're keeping tabs of every foreigner in this region. I think that maybe what's happening in China isn't happening to that extreme in, let's say, the United States or Europe or any other country in the world right now. But I think there's more happening than most of us realize because a lot of it's being done behind the scenes. And so, yes, I was kind of living in the future, but in some ways, I think I was living in the now, but in a
Mm.
more open setting. And part of what I'm trying to do, having now exited out of China, is taking that experience and saying, hey guys, listen,
Hmm.
it is actually worth it to think about privacy and security because I've lived what it's like to not have any of it. And it's not a great life to live. There's something so much better than that.
Man, Josh, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your insight here. Remind everybody where they can find out more about you and what you're up to.
Yeah, you can find me on my website, allthingssecure.com. All Things Secured is also the YouTube channel. I hope you'll go and subscribe to that and see some of the videos that I've got there. And then you can also find me on Twitter at all_secured.
Very cool, Josh. Thank you, buddy. I appreciate your time, and I encourage everybody to
Yep.
go watch him on YouTube. Josh has actually bailed me out of a few situations before I ever really knew who he was. And when I had him on the show here, I was like, you've helped me before, man, and I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Andy. I appreciate it too.